Okay, so we're going to start with looking at the empire building in Africa. So this moves us into 12.2 for our video lecture. So when we look at Africa, we are embarking on a new phase of empire building that's going to affect not only Africa, but also the rest of the world. So what exactly is the demand for colonies going into Africa? It's the raw materials and natural resources. Remember, through our Industrial Revolution unit, these are things that they needed for industrializing their countries. And as they start to deplete their own resources, they need to look elsewhere. And the raw materials and natural resources that are within Africa, they're heading there. It's their greatest source of wealth. And we also start to see the development of cash crops and these cash crop plantations. And we know from our previous section in Southeast Asia that that's going to lead to brutal cheap labor. It's going to lead to food shortages, famine, and starvation. So we're going to see the same thing playing out right here within Africa. So factors promoting imperialism in Africa, and I would definitely star this section. As you see that I have a star, a blue star, and I also add additional information. So when you are filling in the blanks, you want to fill in everything that's red and bold, and the stuff that I have in blue, you want to add in addition to what's on your guided notes. So exactly what is making it easy for the Europeans to go into Africa and take it over? They have the technological advancements. So things like the steam engine and the Maxim gun really help them go further into Africa. That steam engine is going to help them with, their ships and the navigation aspect of it, being able to also bring in trains and being able to easily transport not only themselves, but whatever they're trying to carry in and carry out of Africa. And the Maxim guns. Weapons. You're going to have the advancements in weapons going into Africa because it's a continent that has not industrialized. Another technology is in the medical field. So the perfection of quinine. And quinine is a medicine that would be used for malaria. Now, this is something that this medicine, they were able to retrieve things from South America in order to help them make this medicine that they are now using in Africa to protect the Europeans from malaria. And then this last one here, factors that promote imperialism in Africa. What's making it easy for the Europeans to go in there? It's the fact that Africa is divided. You have people, so many people who are speaking different languages, have different cultures. You have, when you look at Nigeria, you have 250 different ethnic groups. So it's not going to be difficult to go in and use that division to their side, to their advantage. So if you go into an area and you have 3 or 4 different tribes and they don't get along, these different groups of people, then you team up with one. You help them defeat their enemy. Unfortunately, because they've allowed you to come in and help them defeat their enemy, they have now displayed to you that they are not strong enough to defend themselves, and now you're not leaving because you're going to help them defeat their enemy and take that land, and then you're going to take them over. And that's going to continuously play out throughout Africa, and it's going to play out in any area that they go in to colonize. You find a group, you divide and conquer, and you use it to your advantage. There's also the lure of wealth, the discovery of gold and diamonds, and that is definitely going to cause some issues, and particularly when we get down to South Africa. Not only are the British going to go in there, but you're also going to see, when you look at your map of Africa, there are some colonies down there that belong to Germany, and they want access to that gold and diamonds. So in 1884 and 1885, Otto von Bismarck agreed to hold the Berlin Conference. And so he is the chancellor of a unified Germany, which would have been a newly unified Germany. And at the conference, they figure out how are they going to divide Africa up. And so you have 14 European nations, and the United States is also in attendance. And they sat down to agree on what those rules would be. If you notice, no African nation is listed here. They did not include any chief any emperor from any of the kingdoms or tribes that made up Africa during this time. It was Europe came together, the US joined in, and they decided what those rules for of engagement would be. And you notice here that I have man-made divisions highlighted in blue, just like you guys did on Monday when you were claiming items in the room and you were stretching out the yarn. You created man-made divisions, which caused some issues. They did not take into consideration any natural land barriers, so they weren't looking at any waterways or mountains. They decided, I want this region and that region. It's now mine, and I'm going to call it this land. And that's going to create some issues. Also, with the fact that they're throwing, remember from our previous slide, you have so many different groups of people that make up Africa, that speak different languages, that have different culture and customs and religions. And now they're going to lump a bunch of people together and say, you're going to work together because you're doing this for me. And I'm going to have my military here to make sure that you work for me. Which takes us to our next one. They also decided that you must actually claim the land. So that activity we did on Monday, one of the things that we've done in past years, you had to make a flag and you had to come up with a country's name. And when you planted your flag, you actually had to call out, I claim this in the name of whatever country you created. And the countries had to claim that. When we looked at those cards for motives of imperialism, we saw flags. We saw nations that were putting their flags up because they had to claim it. They had to prove that it's theirs. You also have to prove that you can control and maintain it. Not only defend it from anyone who's trying to come in and take it, but you also have to be able to control the indigenous people of that land. You have to be able to crush any revolts that would rise up. So that's definitely going to lead to a military buildup. Hence, we're looking at things that are going to take us into World War I. That military buildup is really going to give a lot of these European nations confidence. They believe in themselves because they're able to go into a non-industrialized area in a continent that has all of these different kingdoms and different groups of people, and they're able to conquer them in areas that they do not have the technology. By 1914, Liberia and Ethiopia are the only free states in Africa. Liberia was a free state that was established by the United States for free blacks in the U.S. that they sent back into Africa in order to create this free state in order to send more free blacks, fearing that there could be a rise up within the United States. Ethiopia, we're going to see, are also known as Abyssinia, will find a way to modernize to protect themselves from being taken over. So the Congo. So with our web quest, you were able to watch the trailer to the documentary of King Leopold's Ghost. And Henry Stanley is that explorer, and we had his quote about the Congo, and we saw that he had very negative things to say about the Congo, that it was a wasteland, it was desolate, it was fruitless, and the Europeans had to come and bring it back to life. Well, Henry Stanley was one of those explorers who wanted to find his name in your history books. But unfortunately for Henry Stanley, he linked himself with King Leopold II. And through that video, we saw that Leopold allowed for the Africans in the Congo to be brutally exploited, chopping off of people's hands if they were unable to bring back enough rubber, or even if they had to kill that rubber vine in order to meet the quota, that they were holding chiefs hostage, women, children, and raping them in order to get the men to do the work. Millions are going to die under Leopold's control. And we know that Leopold acquired this for his own personal gain. He didn't even acquire this colony to actually help out his nation. It was strictly for himself. It was for his own personal greed. But he presented this as, I'm here to spread Christianity. I am here to help the people here within Africa and bring them a better life, when really he was bringing brutality and death and atrocities to this area. A lot of Europe is going to see there's a lot that can be gained in Africa, and we start to see that race, that scramble, where everyone's going to start claiming parts of Africa. And at first, Germany wasn't wanting to get involved, but then they're a little late to the race. So when you filled in Africa, you didn't see a lot of Germany because they were late. So looking at Nigeria, now we're going to look at some areas that the British have come in. And so we have our little map up here of Nigeria, and you also colored this in and you labeled it and colored it in on your map last Friday. So for the British, they have a couple of methods that they use to come in and gain colonies. Some areas are going to use force and other diplomacy. Force means they're bringing in the military. Diplomacy means they're going to go in and maybe offer you something, do a little tit for tat, a little trade. Maybe you have issues with a certain tribe or a group of people, and they're willing to come in and help you out and do favors for you. Really, they're only there to gain control. And when you look at, their conquest of northern Nigeria, they use a joint stock company, the Royal Niger Company, to go in and gain control over this area. And they start to work with the different groups to pull them together. In 1914, we will see that the British will claim all of Nigeria. And that date, 1914, is the year we start heading into, it's the year for World War I. So this competition that these European nations are engaging in through imperialism, it comes to a head in 1914. So still looking at Nigeria, how are they going to manage the colony? And as I said, they use diplomacy and they also use force. And they do pick and choose when they're going to use diplomacy and when they're going to use force. And as I mentioned earlier, Nigeria is a very culturally diverse area. You have about 250 different ethnic groups. Well, you have 3 groups that are very large, and that's who you focus on. And that's who the British are going to focus on. So they do use indirect control successfully with the Fulani, but they also use diplomacy to come in because they had issues with a couple other tribes, and 2 happened to be the ones listed below. The Igbo people happened to be one of those groups of where there were some issues. And this group, they're going to use force, which is going to find a lot of resentment by the chiefs because now their power is limited. And I had mentioned on Wednesday about a book called Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and that focuses on the Igbo people. And it does also show through diplomacy or sending in missionaries to get a feel for the land and start to see if they can get people to start to sway toward their way, to start to assimilate. And then when they're not going to have complete open doors or opening the arms and welcoming them in, then they're going to send in that military and they're going to crush the group, and that's what they end up doing. South Africa is a little different because so far we've had the clash between Europeans and the Africans, or Europeans and the indigenous people. But in South Africa, we're going to have the indigenous people, and we're going to look at the Zulus, and we're also going to see the British, and we're going to see the Boers, who happen to be Dutch settlers, or sometimes you'll see them referred to Afrikaners. So when we look at the Zulus, and particularly we're looking at the time when Shaka Zulu happens to be the chief, around 1816 he's able to create a centralized state. The Zulus are known as a warrior nation. I mean, they're very strong in battle, and a lot of different tribes are very scared of the clash with this group. And you'll see down here along the lower left-hand corner, this is an actual clip or scene from the movie Zulus or Shaka Zulu. And this is before they're going to go into battle with the British, who happen to be in this small little fort. Clearly, when you see the scene, the Zulus outnumber them. And really, when you look at the Europeans coming in, the Africans, everywhere they go, outnumber the Europeans who come there. It's just the Europeans have the technology, the weapons, in order to defeat them. And for the Zulus, being this warrior nation, it definitely does freak out their opponent when they see all of these soldiers coming after them, and they do chants to play mind games with their enemy, and then eventually they charge at them. there's a lot of clash between the British and the Zulus. But the British eventually do defeat them and gain control over Zulu Nation in 1887. Up here in the top, you see a statue of Shaka Zulu. And then here you have some Zulu warriors down here in the lower right-hand corner. Now, here we have our map of South Africa, and you guys, labeled the continent of Africa, so you're a little familiar with some of the places down here in South Africa. But in 1652, you had Dutch settlers and farmers who came to South Africa. So the Dutch have been here for a while. They're also known as the Boers. And they've had the clash already with the Zulus, with the Africans in that area, and they've pushed them out a little bit. But in 1814, at the Congress of Vienna, and remember the Congress of Vienna was that meeting after the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, where they were putting Europe all back together and there had to be some trade-off from here and there. The British are granted control over South Africa by the Congress of Vienna as a payoff for defeating Napoleon. Well, the Dutch come from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands was an area that was under Napoleon's control. He had put his brother in charge of it. So it was a payoff for the British defeating them. So we definitely are going to see that clash between the Boers and the British, because when the British move in about 1814, they're going to continuously make decisions that will benefit their people and not the Africans, nor the Boers who are in that area. And economically, the Boers are not supportive of it, and neither are they politically. So with these clashes that keep happening, eventually many of the Boers will start to move north to escape the clashes that keep happening between these two European groups. And this move north is known as the Great Trek of 1836 to 1840. But the Boers are not going to just stay away. There's going to be a continuous clash because the British are going to constantly make decisions economically and politically that will benefit them. And that's where we end up in this Boer War. It starts in 1899, and then we finally will get all the way into 1910 when the Union of South Africa is formed. So the British and the Boers will clash. So when you get to the Boer War, it's two European nations that are actually fighting each other. And throughout this conflict and all the clashes that keep rising, the Germans are off on the side, and they're encouraging uprisings, they're encouraging the clash with the British, and they are secretly supplying weapons to the Dutch, to the Boers, to constantly cause crisis with the British in this colony. Because again, back to the Berlin Conference, if you can't control it and you can't maintain it, someone else can swoop in and take it. And those gold and diamonds that's in South Africa, the Germans would really like to get a hold of them, and the British are going to do everything in their power to keep them. I've also included in this area, when you look at the Boer War, so we have down here a group of nurses. We started to see nurses heading to the battlefields in the Crimean War back in 1853. Also, along with that, you have cameras where they're actually recording these wars. So we definitely start to see a shift in warfare. And down here in the lower left, we also have like the camps where the soldiers would stay. So we are going to see women very close to those front lines and those battlefields to help the soldiers. Something that also is going to happen down here in the Boer War will be concentration camps. And the British are going to use concentration camps to keep the Dutch women and children, held up in order to try to provoke or to get the men to do what they want, to try to, get this war to go in their favor. And those concentration camps, the use of a concentration camp and the structure of it is something that Hitler's going to use later on. Now, it doesn't mean that the British were doing the things to the Dutch settlers in the camps in South Africa that we will see when we get to World War II. But the structure of a concentration camp and how you can remove your perceived enemies and place them in these holdings is something that Hitler will use later on. Resistance. You're going to find resistance anytime a group of people come in to try to take over. There was resistance in Southeast Asia. We have resistance here in Africa. We're going to see it in India, in China, in Japan. And we're going to see actually Japan's going to take a little different approach than what has happened in the other countries and on the other continents. So Africans are going to confront imperialism, and we're going to see a lot of resistance. But unfortunately, what's going to happen is that the Europeans come in with superior weapons. They have the advancements in technology. Maxim guns is their version of a machine gun. So we do have some unsuccessful movements. You see a lot here with French holdings in Algeria and West Africa. You have resistance movements that have actively fought against the French for almost 50 years. You have another group that has fought the French for 16 years. In German East Africa, you're going to see people who are going to place their faith in their spiritual defense. And that's something, with the other groups of people, the other tribes and kingdoms and groups around them, their spiritual defense has always worked for them because they had believed that their gods were very powerful and they didn't want to offend or upset this group's gods because then they would attack. And they believed they had spiritual magic water that they could sprinkle on themselves, and it would actually create like a shield to protect them. Unfortunately, what they discovered, that water did not provide them a shield to protect them from those machine guns or any kind of gun that would be used against them. The result, about 75,000 died during these unsuccessful movements. But we're also going to see that twice as many will be killed with the use of the cash crops, the food shortages, the starvation, and the famine that's going to set in. We do have a successful resistance movement, and I would star this as number 2. So far we had a successful resistance movement with Siam in Southeast Asia, where they modernized and made themselves look a little bit more European in the way their government functioned, their education system. They abolished slavery. They brought in technology with transportation and telegraph lines. Well, Ethiopia or Abyssinia is going to take a completely different approach. So we have Emperor Menelik II, and he becomes the emperor in 1889, and he is going to modernize a little differently than we saw in Siam. And we have up here our map of Abyssinia or Ethiopia. And it has the places Eritrea, French Somaliland, the British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland. And then you have Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. You're surrounded by these British colonies here. Well, when we look at what exactly is going on here in Ethiopia or Abyssinia, the Italians, the French, and the British, they all want a part of Ethiopia. And when you look at where it's located, it's not a surprise. Ethiopia, it's surrounded by those 3 countries, their colonies. The French, it's small, so it doesn't have a strong holding here. But for the British, this would be great because it's too close to that Suez Canal and they need to protect those trade routes. But the Italians want to expand even further. They want this area. And so Menelik II will be able to play them against each other. It's like you go to the Italians and say, well, this is what the French is offering. What do you have to offer? Go to the British and tell them the same. And keep them after each other and not really focusing that much on them. And while he's doing this, he's also stockpiling an arsenal of weapons where he's purchasing guns from the French and the Russians because the French do not want the Italians to get it. And they also really don't want the British to get a hold of it either. So they're selling Menelik II weapons. And then Italy thinks, oh, I know what I can do. I am going to use the fact that there is a language barrier between Italy and Menelik II here in Ethiopia. So he creates this treaty, and with a play on words, pretty much it would establish, Ethiopia as a protectorate under Italy's control. Well, that's not going to work because Then Italy actually tried to claim Ethiopia as we own you now. You're a protectorate. We're going to protect you from everyone else. Well, Menelik had his stockpile of weapons, and they're actually able to go to war with Italy and defeat them and remain independent. Now, this moment in time is crucial for Ethiopia because when we get to Mussolini after World War I, and we look at the rise of Mussolini in Italy and the power that they feel that they have with their connection to Hitler and Germany, Italy will return to Ethiopia. And at that time, we will refer to it as the Abyssinia crisis. And the next time Italy shows up in Abyssinia or Ethiopia, they're going to bring weapons of mass destruction. They're bringing chemical warfare, and the world does nothing to stop it. But here, Ethiopia remains independent. So when we look at the legacy of colonial rule, the negatives and the positives, they're pretty much going to be the same no matter where we are. So as you will see that I'm not specifically stating Africa under the legacy here for the negative and positive effects, because it doesn't matter whether we are in Southeast Asia, Africa, India, China, no matter where they go, we are going to see the same thing. The Pacific Islands, even when the U.S. goes in, the indigenous people are going to lose their land. They are going to lose their freedom, their independence, and they're going to lose their lives. They are going to see a breakdown of their traditional culture because they're going to be forced to assimilate to whichever nation has come in to take them over. They're going to have to deal with man-made divisions where countries are going to come in and carve it up the way they want. And with those divisions, we will see problems in present day. Positive effects, because the colonies are going in, where they're establishing colonies, and they have to bring in their military, because remember, the Berlin Conference says you have to control it and you have to maintain it, then they have to bring in a military to do so. That will reduce local fighting. So the indigenous people are not going to be fighting each other all the time, because now they have a common enemy, and that's the colonizer. That's the imperialist nation that has come in. We will see some improvements. So we'll see sanitation improvements. We'll see the establishment of hospitals and schools that are going to be created. Now, with these schools being created, teaching of the Western ideas and the laws of the lands with those countries that have come in to take over can work to their benefit or it can work against them. We'll see that these establishment of schools in these colonies, the people are not all being taught the same. So we're not going to see in Africa where they're being taught, the English Bill of Rights and how their rights are being protected, where we as a former colony use that to our benefit to explain why they were violating us and why we had a reason to actually break away. India is going to do the same thing. But in Africa, they're not providing that information. Technology is going to be brought in for economic growth, but this technology can be positive and it can be negative, because when we see that these improvements, it's not necessarily there to improve the lives of the indigenous people. It's to make sure that the Europeans or the Westerners who are moving to these areas have these items there to continue on with their lives. So the technology that's being brought for economic growth, that's for the Europeans or for the Americans who are establishing these colonies. Because when we start to see these places leave these areas and allow the land to go back to the indigenous people, they're not going to teach them how to continue with these improvements or for that growth. So that is the end of our notes for chapter 12, section 2. What I'd like for you to do next is to go to our answer key, which is going to be in this week's folder, and double check your 12-2 terms and questions. All right, you guys have a good day.